today, our agenda for tonight, we're going to cover poverty, trauma, the prison population, specifically the types of crimes that people are incarcerated for, and we're going to move into a theory of violence. There were two topics that we actually were hoping to get to tonight that we realized when we put this together, we can't actually do justice to them. Little forensic humor for you. We can't do justice to them, so we're going to save them for separate webinar conversations, and that is the alternatives to incarceration. We're gonna cover that fully in an entire webinar, and also we're then going to do a webinar on violence and life sentences and talk specifically about violence. So we're not going to get to that tonight. Also, we want to address your suggestions. So thank you to everyone who, when you signed up for this webinar, you put in suggestions of things that you would like to hear more about. And we want to make sure that we get to those as well, maybe like another town hall, like the one we're going to be hosting this Wednesday. So just a quick recap of what we covered last time so that we're all on the same page. The United States is ranked #1 in terms of incarceration. We have over 2.2 million people in our prisons and jails. We incarcerate people at the rate of 655 per 100,000, and that vastly, drastically outweighs any other country in the world. Some of our mass incarceration problem is the result of sweeping legislation that was passed in the 80s and the 90s. It brought about a 500% increase in our prison and jail population over 4 decades. And this is in spite of the fact that crime rates actually started falling in the early 1990s and have been falling since. And research has shown that our falling crime rates are not due to our mass incarceration problem. Not all populations are impacted equally in the United States, as tends to be a common theme as we're discovering these days. All systems disproportionately impact people of color. Black men have vastly taken the brunt of this. 1 in 3 Black men have a chance of going to prison during their lifetime. Another distinction here in the United States is that our criminal justice legislation is created by our politicians almost completely separate from any sort of knowledgeable body or scientific institution. So it's based more on feelings and perceptions, and our politicians play a significant role, which is very different than other countries. So we may think that as a democracy, that maybe other countries who are also democracies do the same thing, and it's just not true. They collaborate so much more with their scientific community. And then lastly, another defining thing of being in the United States is that we use extreme sentences. We have life sentences and life without parole, as many of you know. We also have capital punishment in several of our states, and on the federal level, as you might have been reading in the news lately. This is drastically out of step with the rest of the world. 1 in 7 incarcerated people here in the US are serving a life sentence, whether it's due to LWOP or a virtual life sentence. So mass incarceration is a symptom. You know, we've reached this point where we're looking at the problem and we're saying, oh my gosh, here are all our statistics. Here's the problem that's in front of us. But as with many symptoms, there's an underlying disease. And what we're seeing is the result of economic and racial disparities in the United States. So we don't have our prison mass incarceration problem didn't begin with somebody committing an act of violence. It actually begins in the womb with children born into poverty. So in order to understand mass incarceration, you have to understand the impact of poverty in America, specifically on our children. So a quick definition of poverty. In 2020, the federal guidelines that were issued identified the poverty level for a family of 4 as making less than $26,200. So I just want to stop for a second and acknowledge, like, if you're living in Boston like I am, trying to imagine being a family of 4 and making less than $26,000, that's impossible for even me to imagine. So that's the poverty level. So all of these stats I'm about to provide you are under that level, right? So the US is very disgustingly ranked as #2 among 35 advanced economies in terms of the child poverty rate. So I want to be very clear, that's #2 in the wrong direction. That means that there's only one other advanced economy that has more poor children than we do. More than 15.5 million, which translates to 1 in 5 children, so that's under the age of 18, are living in poverty. Sadly, Disproportionately impacting people of color, as with other systems, nearly 2 in 5 Black children are poor, followed by 1 in 3 Hispanics, compared to 1 in 8 white children. The younger you are, the poorer you are. So nearly 2 in 5 Black or Hispanic babies, so that's under the age of 2, are living in poverty. So overall, nearly 1 in 4 children under the age of 5 live in poverty. So that's 25% of our children are living in poverty. I get very emotional when I talk about these statistics. I hope you can understand, but this is one of those points where I literally have to stop and walk away from my presentation because I'm so upset. So I just want to acknowledge it's a really horrible place to be. Why is it important for us to understand poverty in America and how it relates to our children? One of the reasons is because of a phenomenon known as the cradle to prison pipeline. Some of you may have heard of the school to prison pipeline, and actually it's the same thing. So it's just that some people focus on that you can intervene easier in children's lives once they reach school level. So a lot of advocacy groups have sort of translated to the school to prison pipeline, but the original model that was issued in 2007 by the Children's Defense Fund is cradle to prison pipeline. And some advocates have even argued that it should be womb or pregnancy to prison pipeline, because that's a more accurate statement. So in their advocacy work, the Children's Defense Fund identified poverty as the largest driving factor to incarceration, as exacerbated by race. And this is not surprising for many of us, as we understand that the impact of poverty can last a lifetime. Poverty is trauma. It's not an event, it's a context. So it's the water you drink, it's the food you eat, it's the air you breathe. If you are living in poverty, it is literally every aspect of your life. And it's also the unifying factor inside prison. So when you talk to incarcerated populations, regardless of race, ethnicity, background, religion, sexual orientation, poverty is a unifying factor. Almost all of them have come from households that are economically struggling. So when you think about kids in poverty, think about the variety of ways in which it will impact their lives. This is why it's called a pipeline, because there's not one trajectory. It's several different factors. So when a child is living in poverty, they are more likely to have developmental delays. They are more likely to have behavioral issues at school. That makes them less likely to graduate high school. It makes them more likely to go on to be an adult who is underemployed. And all of the different risk factors, like in between, there's so many, it's hard to imagine sometimes. They all bring an individual closer to being incarcerated, like all of them. And as we know, obviously, poverty increases the chances of substance abuse and homelessness, and those things definitely increase chances of being incarcerated. We talk a lot about trauma now in 2020, but trauma was not always something that we discussed on a regular basis. And one of the reasons actually that we now talk a lot about it is because of the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, also known as the ACEs study. It was conducted in published in 1998. And it was the first of its kind. It was groundbreaking. Over 8,000 people in the United States responded. The researchers asked people about their experiences with psychological, physical, and sexual abuse, as well as witnessing violence against your mother or living with a household member who had substance abuse issues, a mental illness, suicidality, or having an incarcerated family member. What these researchers found was that they were able to connect trauma with a variety of really negative outcomes, everything from physical to psychological and emotional. So you were more likely to develop hypertension, diabetes, you're more likely to be obese. They were even able to connect trauma to premature death. So why is this important, right? We're here to talk about mass incarceration. This is very important to the conversation of mass incarceration. So as my good friend and amazing colleague said to me recently, we come to prison broken people. So in order to understand why we have a mass incarceration problem and what we can do to undo our mass incarceration problem, we have to have a better understanding of trauma. So the ACEs study has been applied by several several large scale studies have used the ACEs criteria with incarcerated populations. And what they found is that up to 90% of the incarcerated population report experiencing at least one ACE, and 50% report experiencing 4 or more ACEs. When we dig into that a little deeper, that same study found that only 9% reported 0 events of trauma. So when you flip that around, that means that 91% has trauma in their history. And only 11% reported 1 event, 14% 2, 16% 3. So the reason that matters is because if you have a traumatized population, which the incarcerated population has been identified now as the most traumatized population in the United States, we have to understand something called complex trauma. So most of us are familiar with PTSD, a traumatic event. Complex trauma is when you take, the idea behind it is 1 + 1 = 2. So if you've experienced one traumatic event, you might be able to measure somebody's distress. Maybe there's symptoms of depression or anxiety and how they're doing. Maybe they've lost their job, and you can see that that's a direct result of trauma. But when you add a second trauma on top of the first one, it's hard to pull apart what is actually now happening for that person. 1 + 1 is greater than 2. It's not just like that easy to break it down. So when we are talking about the prison population, we are talking about a massive amount of complex trauma. Another phenomenon that's related to that is known as polyvictimization. And that's the phenomenon that refers to the probability of experiencing an additional trauma if you have one. So when they've looked at the ACE studies and its impact, if you have had one ACE trauma, your chances of having a second one are 65 to 93%, depending on which study you look at. Your chances of having 2 or more additional traumas happen is 40 to 74%. So I promised that we talk a little bit about the prison population, but we're going to dig deeper into this at our presentation that specifically addresses violence. And one of the reasons why is because there are 2 problems that we run into in the criminal justice reform world that I think are red herrings to these conversations. They distract from the larger point. So the first is this idea that you can break down people into violent versus non-violent. So when we look at these statistics, like for example, what you're seeing here at the state level and at the federal level is you're seeing what people are serving time for. And that's very problematic. If you have any understanding of how prosecutors like pile on charges in order to coerce people to take plea deals, then you understand a lot of times what people are serving time for is not necessarily the action of what they did. And that works both ways, right? We don't always know the worst thing that somebody has done. But we also sometimes get an impression that like all homicide offenders are the same or something like that, and that's just inaccurate. So these statistics are a little misleading, really, when we're talking about human behavior. But for purposes of reform, when you look at the federal level, right, the overwhelming majority of people are serving time for drug offenses, and that's the direct result of the war on drugs. And then at the state level is where most people are serving time for violent offenders. So it's a myth to believe we can address mass incarceration without addressing violence. And we hope you'll join us for that conversation. The second distractor that I just want to put out there is that oftentimes people will say to me when I'm talking about giving people second chances, people will go straight to the cases of really horrific sexual violence. Or involving children. And that's again, it's a distraction, because when you look at the number of people who are serving time for all sexual assaults, regardless of who they were committed upon, it's actually 13% of the violent population. So you're talking about 13% of about 62% of people. It's a really small number. And I would never advocate for designing an entire system around that small of a population. Okay, moving right along. So the theory of violence that Jasmine and I are very familiar with that we wanted to talk about. So this part of the presentation is going to be more like a conversation between Jasmine and I, and then we'll move into the Q&A. So Dr. Kenneth Hardy and Dr. Tracy Leslofley wrote a seminal piece of work almost 2 decades ago now. They are child psychologists out of New York, and the book is called Teens Who Hurt. The name is a little misleading. It's written specifically for clinical interventions, to break the cycle of violence for juveniles. But if you have ever read it, and some of you have, I know, and many of us also in reading it can see ourselves in the descriptions of this model of violence and how we get there. So it's very relatable even as an adult. So Dr. Hardy and Dr. Leslofley, this is their model. They basically say that experiences of devaluation, disruption of community, and the dehumanization of loss results in the phenomenon of rage. And rage is the precursor to violence. So there is, no matter what theory of violence you look at, I just want to be clear that the scientific community pretty much agrees that there's no such thing as snapping. That's not a thing. So a violent act has a buildup. And so in that buildup, there's a story. And a lot of times in trying to understand how we can prevent violence and how we can move through healing requires us to hear the story of what actually happened. I tend to think of rage as like and we'll talk a little bit about it in a second, but I think of it as like emotional lightning that's looking for grounding. And the act of violence was how the lightning made it to the ground, but it's not the reason that the person committed the act of violence. So devaluation, as defined in Teens Who Hurt, is a process that strips a person or a group of people of dignity and self-worth. There are 2 types of devaluation, situational and societal. I think of situational as acute and specific to a time and place, and societal as the larger, broader context. So we have some examples of situational devaluation: abandonment, abuse, neglect, divorce, peer rejection. And then in society, we have all the isms, all the different ways in which groups of people are discriminated against. So Jasmine, I am going to turn it over to you.
So thank you so much, Sean, for all of that information. It was wonderful. First off, I just want to apologize if I start breaking up. I'm going to just cut my video feed and just speak that way without video feed. So yes, devaluation. Being born a woman in this country, instantly certain labels are put upon you and expectations. And if you don't fit into those expectations, then certain types of devaluation start to happen to you. But when you're born as a woman of color, those labels and expectations are then compiled and added more to you. And you automatically fail those expectations because white, oh, sorry, because white men who dominate this society are trying to dictate what a woman of color is supposed to say and act, right? So then I just want to say that they set the norm, and being of color, I'm outside of that norm. I'm marginalized because of that norm that they've set for us. So I've been devalued because of my hair, my weight, my skin color. I've been sexualized instead of intellectualized. As a young girl, I internalized all of this without the proper language or understanding of what was happening to me. I internalized that I was different. Silently, I grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood town. I was the only kid of color. I knew I was different. They wore Abercrombie and Fish. I wore Fila, Nike, and Fubu. For show and tell, they brought in seashells. I brought in a handmade handkerchief with cartoons that my dad had made in prison and sent for my birthday. I was not the same. When I entered the prison system, I was devalued. See, women are sentenced far more harshly than men. The day I was sentenced, there was 10 of us, with a combined sentence of 90 years. I led the pack with a 10 to 15, earning respect from my broken brothers. Inside prison, I was devalued. I was abused, never violently, but otherwise, yes, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. As a woman, I was devalued every time her hand slid too far up my thigh and her sexual orientation was questionable during a pat search. I was devalued because I was in a system designed to house men, to cage men only. From the cells, the food, the clothing, the programming were all designed for men. They could never really understand me, so they devalued me because they never truly try to help me. Thank you.
Thank you, Jasmine. Let's see. So I know you had a quote here, Jasmine. Do you want to share that? I'm going to unmute you. Hold on. Oh, I might have lost you, Jasmine. Where are you?
I actually can't see the quote.
You can't see it? Okay. I apologize. Let's move on. We'll continue.
Okay.
The next part of the model is the disruption of community. So if we think about community as a synonym for home being a place where we're accepted, where we're comforted, where we find compassion and understanding, violent individuals often suffer from a chronic state of psychological homelessness. So essentially, their existence is ravaged by a sense of existential alienation. So when we take all of the different risk factors from the devaluation category, it's easy to see how they also get into disruption of community. So if at the primary level you experience abuse, that's a disruption of your primary community. If you are rejected at school by your peers, that's an experience of disruption in your extended community. And then on a larger level, again, if you're a minority or if you're just different from the people that are around you, you don't have a cultural community around you, that is also a disruption of community. So Jasmine, I'm going to turn that back over to you.
All right. So, disruption of community. It's important to understand that community is something, as Ken Hardy and Tracy Lawley said, it's a place where you feel safe. So growing up, I grew up in a lot of chaos and dysfunction. I always call it chaotic and dysfunctional. So I was always in a perpetual state of disruption. There was constant disruption in my family between my parents with their domestic violence. There was neglect. I experienced neglect not because they couldn't dress me or feed me or shelter me, but because nobody ever took the time to ask me who I was or how I felt or what I wanted to be in life. There was no real conversation. So that's why with we always say authentic conversation. It has to happen because in order for change to come about, there has to be a conversation between individuals to come to an understanding. And there was never really an understanding between me and my family because there was no conversation. With that being said, when I went to prison isn't a place where they want to see us unified, right? Because community, again, is a safe, loving place. They didn't want to see that. There's actually policies and regulations and rules that prevent that. I always explain it in the sense that if I saw a sister down and out and she needed a bar of soap, I would give her that bar of soap. I would give her the back then 35-cent stamp that she would need to write her children or to write her lawyer or to send her daughter a birthday card. And I would take the risk of getting in trouble, and sometimes I did get in trouble. But again, it's like we're all in this together, but prison, again, is not built that way. It's not set up to see people come together and change and uplift one another. It's a place where they want to continuously keep us down and degraded and dehumanized, and one way of dehumanizing someone is keeping them from community, keeping them from coming together, loving one another, understanding one another. And instead what happens is people are hurting people inside because we can't get that sense of community. So I was in prison. Yes, it's just a perpetual state of disruption of community inside of prison, and there's no wonder why violence erupts inside prison walls. Inside prison's walls. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you, Jasmine. And for those of you who might not know, since a lot of our conversations we're inviting, people who have no experience with incarceration to come, it might sound trivial when Jasmine says that she was going to get in trouble. But actually, what she's referring to is something known as like D reports. When you go before a parole board, one of the things that they look at in terms of whether or not you could be able to come home is how many tickets you have or how many D reports you have. And so Jasmine giving a bar of soap to somebody and then being written up for it could actually potentially have consequences about whether or not she can come home, which I think we can all agree is yeah, not okay. Moving right along. So the last concept that's involved before we get to the final step of rage is the dehumanization of loss. Now, this is different than loss in general. So one of the things that research has supported is that if a child goes through trauma and loss specifically, if it is acknowledged and it's handled and it's addressed, then actually the outcomes for children can be really positive. They can learn a lot of life lessons. They can feel even closer to their family. But this is the dehumanization of loss, which means unacknowledged, unmourned, unhealed losses. And as you see from this list of 10 types of loss that are in Teens Who Hurt, again, it's really about the idea that you go through this loss and then no one in your family talks about it. So this is something that also the ACEs study that they did with the incarcerated population was found to be present a lot of the time. So incarcerated people overwhelmingly said that if they did experience an ACE trauma that was related to loss, like a death of a family member, there have been many stories where people have said that their family literally just pretended that that person didn't even exist, and they just went upon their life. And as a 5-year-old, you're not really sure what was happening there. And so that's basically the idea around dehumanization. Jasmine, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Prashani. So dehumanization for me was really big when I first read Teens Who Hurt. It gave me the language to understand all the losses that I endured in my childhood and then that I continued to endure while I was incarcerated. So I lost my father to alcoholic rages and to his dope addiction. I lost him repeatedly during his prison stays, and then my family lost me when I went to prison. I lost my childhood to poverty because I became a drug dealer at 13 years old. I lost my childhood when I became a teen parent at 15 years old. I lost pieces of myself when he cheated, when he became addicted, when he lied, when he beat me. I lost myself when he raped me. I lost myself to my addiction silently. When I went to prison, the dehumanization continued. See, I lost my name and I became a number. I lost the ability to move on my own because I wore shackles and chains, and they call us chattel. I lost my membership to motherhood. I lost the right to my body. I lost years of time that can never be replaced. And I just want to point out that I always hold myself accountable to what I did. And I do believe that incarceration was merited there. But how we incarcerate, what we do to each other during the process, and actually what happens in prison has to change. That's why I'm here today, right? Is looking for that change. So I lost the right to make choices. I lost the right to be a U.S. citizen. I became disenfranchised. I became this label of felon, and now I'm home, and there's certain obstacles and barriers to becoming productive.
Thank you, Jasmine.
Yep.
Now I've put up your beautiful piece of writing, but I'm wondering, can you see it?
I cannot, but can you read it?
I can, but so everyone, I'm going to do this this justice. Jasmine wrote this beautiful poem. She was going back through and rereading some of the material for Teens Who Hurt, and she was inspired to write this, and so I'm going to read it for you all. Because we endured and experienced loss upon loss, we became broken. We entered the system you called justice. There you told us we didn't matter. I don't matter. And there you dehumanized us, took away human potential's hope, locked me up, locked us up in a cage you called justice. Okay, moving right along. So in the model, the idea is that if you experience devaluation, disruption of community, and the dehumanization of loss, some combination of those experiences then translate to the emotional experience of rage. And rage is the precursor to violence. So the difference between anger and rage, anger is like a match and rage is like a forest fire. But one of the other really important distinctions is that anger has a short life cycle. It goes up and then come down. Suppressed anger is the seed of rage, and rage is an intense, sustained, and consuming emotion. So if you've ever known somebody who has a problem with rage, you probably know what I'm talking about here. Maybe it's yourself, because I can identify. The dimensions of rage that Dr. Hardy and Dr. Leslofley identified are the explosive, silent, and internally directed rage. So the explosive, externally directed rage is obvious, whereas in the silent, externally directed rage was referred to as smoldering. So maybe you didn't expect it, but you could sense that this person is really angry or full of rage. And then people often don't think about the internally directed rage, but that often shows up in depression and suicidality. So in psychology, we talk about homicide as suicide directed outwards. So it's important to talk as we're talking about rage, though, and as I say these things, right, I know that here in America we're very adverse, like we don't have a lot of risk tolerance. So sometimes when we meet somebody who's full of anger, we sort of feel like they're a ticking time bomb and like violence is inevitable. And I want to be very clear that when we're talking about rage, it's not the experience of rage that makes you violent. It's whether or not the suppression of rage continues, and whether or not that person can then find an outlet, and whether or not the source of their rage dissipates over time, or there's some sort of validation or therapy or work that is done. And so, Jasmine, if you don't mind, I'm going to turn it over to you to speak about your experience.
All right. First off, I want to start by saying that rage is an emotion. And emotions are natural, and it's the action that we do that causes it to be that can cause it to be something bad, right? And then with that being said, I just want to let you guys know that the way I speak about rage is not to be incendiary. You know, it is my truth. It's the way that I experience it, and it's the way that I verbalize it. So my rage is powerful. She's powerful. She believes she's in control, and she is in control. When she comes in, nothing else matters. When my rage comes in, she is in my mind, she is in my heart, she is in my soul. My heart beats fast. My mind is focused and sharp. My eyesight is honed, and that's all I see is her. And she's the one that's running the show because she is powerful and she's in control. I feel her in my hands. My palms are sweating. I feel her in my feet because we are walking together to one beat. When she is in control, nothing else matters, nothing else exists. Because that's what it is all about. It is suffering those losses and being able to say that I'm still in control, that I matter. She is angry and she is hurt. She is the young me. She is the mother in me. She is the daughter in me. She is everything that I am. And everything that I've suffered and everything that I've endured comes to the forefront. And she's hurting and she's been hurt. And that's when she acts out. And when she acts out, she hurts people because she's hurt, because I'm hurt. And I'm not disassociating by calling my rage she. I'm just making her feminine and letting you know that females, women experience rage, right? My rage, she is not quiet, she is not loud. She is quiet like the wind and stealthy. When she comes about, there's just nothing in her way. There's nothing that she cannot do. She's ambitious. She's grown. She's confident. She's not the weak child in me. She has this language. She has this way about her. She smiles. She laughs. But she's silent in her hurt and her pain. And when it all comes tumbling out, it's still in control. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. So to Jasmine's point, the internally directed rage, we often see that in women who are suffering. So depression and suicidality are very high. They have high rates for women who are incarcerated. Those types of experiences are socialized as opposed to acting outward, right? Women often go inward to destroy, not to like gender stereotype, but that's been the tendency over the decades or whatnot. Rage is complicated. And so what we're advocating for here at I Am is that the story behind the violence is how we will get to the healing. So Jasmine already mentioned she takes accountability for what it is that she has experienced and the harm that she did. But all of us have also done a lot of harm, and she's experienced a lot of harm, right? So here at I Am, what we're talking about is that if we uncover the story behind the rage, we can hopefully move into a place of accountability and therefore healing. So I think we have one more quote. So in Teens Who Hurt, there's a quote that Jasmine picked from the text, and I'll read it. When poet Dylan Thomas wrote, "Rage, rage against the dying of the light," he was saying that we must not surrender to injustice, pain, loss, despair, or hopelessness. Instead, we must see the death of hope as a travesty, as life's cruelest injustice. And even against this more despairing and seemingly insurmountable of circumstances, we must resist. Through rage, we must find the inspiration, the will, the raw determination to resist, to never give up, to create hope through never surrendering to hopelessness. Rage is essential to our survival. Okay, and so before I have Jasmine read her quote, I don't know if you guys can see the one that I picked, but to end our presentation and move into the Q&A, the quote that I selected is actually from the environmental activist and anthropologist Jane Goodall. I had the honor of being in a presentation that she gave, and when she was asked about how to create long-term systemic change and actually how to get people involved and interested in actually creating real change, she said, you have to reach the heart. Don't make people lose face. It never works. And I very much agree with her. So Jasmine, would you share the quote you selected to end on tonight?
Yes, just really quickly before I read my ending quote, I just wanted to point out with my rage quote that leaders before us, people before us, MLK, Rosa Parks, Malcolm X, the Black Lives Matter movement, have all used the rage in a positive way to affect change in our country and our society. We have to change the connotations that we have about rage and violence and start asking questions as to why did this person commit this act of violence? What happened to her? What happened to my brother? What happened to my sister? We have to start moving as a community together and start asking these questions and not writing people off because they committed something that society says that deems them a monster. So with that being said, my quote is from Angela Davis. She's beautiful. I love her. She says prisons are designed to incapacitate. Incapacitation of people in prisons is a living death, and that is truth. They take everything away from us, and you're just living. Thank you.